All right, welcome to this explainer on consent and authority. Today, we're diving straight into some pretty profound structural frameworks of law, personal sovereignty, and local governance, exactly as they're laid out in our source documents. We're going to be unpacking a very specific, detailed model of how society actually operates when it's properly aligned with fundamental rights. So, let's get into it. Here's our quick roadmap for today. We're going to cover an introduction and the concept of consent, then we'll look at the source of authority, move into delegation and offices, hit fiduciary accountability, explore the limits of authority, and finally wrap up with practical application and a summary. We're basically tracing these concepts from their philosophical roots all the way down to practical self-governance. Section 1, Introduction, the foundations. To really grasp this whole system, we've got to understand a key point from the source materials. All lawful structures rely on a strict, unbroken chain of authority. You can't just pull rules out of thin air. There has to be a legitimate origin point. So here's how the documents visualize this top-down chain. It's like a waterfall. Authority originates with the creator, referred to as the fountain, then flows right into natural law, embeds itself into individual free will, and only then moves outward to delegated community powers. The texts argue that all law is essentially rooted in this very first trust, where humanity was given free will but expected to follow natural law. Moving right along to Section 2, what is consent? Let's look at how this builds into the idea of individual consent, because this is a massive cornerstone of this entire legal framework. Since authority flows down to the individual actually has to agree to be governed. Take a look at the historical case of Cruden versus Neal mentioned here. It's used by the sources to anchor a really huge premise. Any governance without your direct, individual consent is totally illegitimate. The texts cite this to show that unless you've explicitly contracted or, actually consented to be ruled by an institution, you remain independent. You're only bound by natural law. So consent isn't just assumed, it's an active, required mechanism. All right, Section 3. What is authority? As we follow the chain downward, the texts make a really sharp distinction between just having power, which, let's face it, can just be taken by force, and holding actual lawful authority. The documents point out that humanity has always kind of lusted after the power to create laws, but actual, legitimate authority, that has to immediately align with natural law, which the texts gorgeously describe as the intrinsic tapestry of creation. Basically, if a human law contradicts this fundamental rule, it's considered to have absolutely no force or validity. Lawful authority is just a reflection of fundamental natural justice. Simple as that. Section 4 brings us to the delegation of authority. The big question here is, how do sovereign individuals take their inherent authority and collectively delegate it to a community structure? How do we actually build a society out of totally independent people? Well, what happens if we have rights, but we just don't actively exercise them? The sources paint a pretty stark reality here. Possessing a right means literally nothing if you don't step up and take responsibility to govern yourself. You can't just exist, sit back, and claim you have rights. Self-governance demands action. I love the picking blueberries metaphor the text uses for this. Think about it. Having a contract that says you have the right to pick blueberries means zero unless you actually hike up the hill, bend down, and do the physical work. It's the exact same thing with your political status. You have to actively declare it and participate in your local assembly to avoid falling into administrative subjection and dependency. Essentially, if you don't govern yourself, well, someone else is going to gladly step in and do it for you. Which leads perfectly into Section 5, public offices. Once people actually choose to actively self-govern and do the work, the sources say they create a parallel administrative structure called the Jural Assembly. And within that assembly, there are specific functional roles needed to keep things running. We're talking about record keepers who maintain quorums, marshals at arms who secure the living court, all the way to coordinators. Coordinators are fascinating because historically, they acted as circuit riders, literally going door to organize meetings. The point is, everyone has a specific job to make sure the machinery of self-governance keeps humming along. Now, you really want to pay attention to this distinction right here. The sources flat out reject the idea of positional authority, where elected representatives start acting like emperors or treat themselves as somehow more equal than the rest of us. Instead, they endorse functional authority. In this model, leaders are called deputies. They're just agents hired to do very specific tasks under what's called the prudent man rule. And if they step out of line, the assembly can easily recall them. It's a totally different dynamic. Section 6 focuses on accountability. Because these public deputies hold functional authority rather than a blank check to rule over people, they are held to some incredibly strict standards. The texts are crystal clear. Public officers are fiduciaries. They are trustees of the people. They owe a duty to the public that is exactly as strict as managing a private financial trust. So if they deliberately conceal material information from the public they serve, that's not just frowned upon. According to the sources, that is literally common law fraud. And let's look at how this strict accountability works in everyday assembly life. Assemblies are public bodies meant for serious business, right? They aren't a place for airing private grievances. The texts strictly warn that stuff like gossiping, power-mongering, or infighting destroys group morale. Anyone causing that kind of drama is subject to immediate disciplinary action and can be booted from the meeting by the marshals. So accountability isn't just about stopping financial fraud, it's about maintaining basic civil discourse too. Okay, Section 7, Limits of Authority. Let's see what happens legally when those firm boundaries are crossed by public servants. The documents cite this historic Supreme Court case, Cohens v. Virginia, to hammer home a zero-tolerance policy for overreach. If an administrator or a judge assumes power that was never delegated to them, it's not just viewed as an oops, my bad administrative error. The texts view it as a direct usurpation and literal treason against the founding agreements. No gray area there. Furthermore, the text tells us that if government corporations or administrative agencies go bankrupt or become grossly incompetent, those delegated powers don't just vanish into thin air. Nope. They automatically bounce right back to the original donors, meaning the sovereign people and the unincorporated states. Basically, the people always retain that ultimate authority to take their delegated power back. Let's move to Section 8, Practical Examples. How does this strict take on jurisdiction, consent, and authority actually play out in real life? The sources use this really striking analogy. They compare forcing a private traveler to get a driver's license to, well, forcing someone to get a hunting license when they have absolutely zero intention of ever hunting deer. The texts argue that driving is strictly a commercial activity. So if you're just traveling privately and someone coerces you into signing up for a commercial license, that's considered an act of self-incrimination fraud meant to drag you into a foreign jurisdiction. Wild, right? Finally, Section 9, Summary. Let's pull all these distinct puzzle pieces together to summarize this entire framework we've been looking at. So, as we've seen, this whole system hinges on a few core ideas. 1, authority flows from the creator down to the individual. 2, legitimate government requires your explicit consent. 3, it operates using accountable fiduciaries with functional authority, not rulers. And 4, if those powers are abused, they revert right back to the people. But the catch is, it requires the active, educated participation of the community to actually maintain it. Which leaves us with a pretty profound question drawn straight from these documents. In this massive chain of consent and authority, where do your actions place you? Remember the blueberries? Are you just standing by letting someone else administer your rights? Or are you stepping up to govern yourself? Think about it. Thanks for walking through this explainer with me today.